Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today we're going to be talking about the formidable question of whether or not the system, and we do mean the economic system primarily, but there's some adjacent issues related to that, whether or not the system is rigged, whether or not people in general are getting a fair shake at economic progress and general quality of life. And I don't want to spoil the answer there, but I have a guest on. I've had him on a number of times. Friend of mine, as well as YouTube consultant who also looks into these other matters on occasion. And I think it's a fundamental question the younger generations ask themselves all the time, particularly millennials and the up and coming Zoomers. What what's happened? Oftentimes we hear from boomers, actual boomers, not the internet meme, but also some mimetic boomers of the simplicity behind economic success. It's just entailing something along the lines of just working hard. If you only work four jobs for long enough, you will get there. It's just a matter of time. And there's either a kind of naivete or just plain outright ignorance contained with statements like that. I've noticed it myself, having talked to some of these people, actual proverbial boomers who rant on about things along the lines of, well, I was working three jobs. Eventually I made my way, and you can too. And this, I think, doesn't withstand the test of scrutiny in the current year, I would say. Well, but I'm going to turn to my guest because he's much better to explain these things than I am.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, this is a question everybody on both sides of the political spectrum are asking themselves. And is the system rigged? And I'll have the answer for that in a second. But what you were getting to actually is, as you're saying, a fundamental question every generation asks themselves, right? So whether it's the boomer or the generations immediately following that, those people have already entered and been through the system. So when they think back, they're thinking to a time that no longer exists. So the question Zoomers now and even millennials are asking themselves, is the system rigged? They're asking that having now just entered the system. And I can tell you just by surveying the landscape, the answer is yes. And I have news for you. Both Republicans and Democrats agree with me, though for different reasons. And I'd imagine you'd guess what those reasons are.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that both sides of the aisle, well, obviously they have their biases, otherwise they wouldn't be in the political camps they are. But what I see is interesting about the sort of the left and the right dynamic is the left and the right both see partial truths, and they also are blinded by their own particular ideology. So on the right, I would say the biases, both positive and negatives, and the negative one is, well, if you just work hard, you'll be fine, as if hard work were somehow the essential formula to success in life. But they also recognize things such as the nonsense of egalitarianism. They know that most people on the right know that people aren't exactly identical, and you're going to get different outcomes due to people's different innate abilities. Now, the left, their bias is, well, it's all deception. People are cheating their way because their premise, their bias, is, of course, that people are basically the same, and so disparate outcomes um, must be achieved through some kind of deception. Both sides tend to miss the forest of the trees and how much luck is just the vicissitudes of fortune basically are playing a role in all of this. But so there's sort of a partial insight on both sides, but also a partial clouding of judgment. Um, Neither side being really being able to get at the crux of the matter, I think.
Yes, no, it's very interesting you say that. And surprise, surprise, the statistics exactly back up what you're saying. So I have Pew Research here, and they survey Americans, and on the headline, 70% of all Americans say the US economic system unfavorably favors the powerful and at a more broad level is rigged. What was interesting though is that they split this up based on political leanings, as in party loyalty. And the same question is evenly divided, but when you ask Democrats or Democrat leaners, regardless of income, the vast majority, 86% of them, say the system unfavorably favors powerful interests. Now, it's interesting about that response, as you were saying, is they'll point to things like powerful interests and they'll focus mainly on the racial inequality gap, which certainly exists. But I find that that's coming from the left side actually is just a way of diffusing the greater problem. Like, so they'll focus and fixate it on all day without actually on the racial income gap. I mean, without actually addressing any of the downstream effects or the underlying causes of that. And ultimately, if you fixate on that all day, there's no solution to be had. But then on the right side, the same problem presents itself, but for the same priors and pre-existing biases that are doing it, right? So um, higher income Republicans, only 37% of them say this system is unfair, where 63% of lower income Republicans do say that. And I think this is best emblemized by the Jubilee video you and I both have seen. And that video was minimum wage earners versus millionaires. They surveyed them and they asked, how many of you do you think that if you work hard enough, you can make it? And all 3 of the millionaire responders in that video said, yes, in fact, you could make it if you worked hard enough, whereas only one of the average income earners said that was possible. And that's very interesting, the difference in mentality and what people are attributing to whatever happens to be their, the net result of their life going through the system. And I think you could talk a lot about that as well, which I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this in our historical discussions privately, but I mean, human history is sort of defined by survivorship bias, right?
Indeed.
Um, you the say the history that we've talked about this before, the history of the United States would be very different had there been no Revolutionary War, or if the revolutionaries had lost. Um, the tales we would be telling, if indeed we even would have, well, you would have, you can trace your ancestry back to the Mayflower, been in the United States at all. And the same is true of individual people's histories. I mean, survivorship bias is arguably the most powerful force coloring how we weave narratives for ourselves. Because the problem with being a human being is our limited perceptual apparatus, our limited ability to interpret events. And we tend, just to do innate psychology, to look to things that are quote unquote more in our control. So hard work, millionaires who've worked hard, but they then miss these vicissitudes of fortune, these steps along the way that were precipitated largely just by dumb luck. Maybe you knew somebody that recommended some internship at some point in time, which got you hooked up or connected with a bunch of people, and you might acknowledge that, but that might be you might minimize the role of things like that. Whereas if you hadn't been standing in that room on that day, having talked to, Mr. Smith, you might never even gotten to the internship, which might have just totally ended up giving you a different career path and just life path trajectory in general. And so when you're very successful, this tendency to reinforce these internal cognitive biases of survivorship bias, discounting the role of fortune and luck, that becomes all the more reinforced. And in fact, people have noted this, psychologists, researchers, that the most successful people have this the worst, that is survivorship bias, for obvious reasons that I've just enumerated. And what emerges from this is a kind of mentality. It's I don't call it an aristocratic mentality, but sort of mentality of moral goodness, or a mentality of qualities of good character. So that if you're not a millionaire, if you're struggling, there's something fun. Not just you aren't just struggling because I don't know, you grew up in a poverty-ridden situation, or you had health issues. It's because there's something
It's your
fundamentally flawed.
mindset's fault, right?
Yeah, your mindset, and there's
That's what they
something
say.
fundamentally flawed with your human character. And so this is the problem with survivorship bias in this context is basically it gets amplified the more successful you are. But the fact of the matter is there's no there's no such thing as a self-made man in the traditional American sense. There are always favorable wins. And by the way, it's been documented that the most successful sprinters in the Olympics have always had a favorable tailwind, by the way. Was this crucial to their success? Maybe, maybe not, but it certainly helped them. And I'm sure that they're not the god of thunder. They didn't invoke the favorable tailwind, they just happened to receive it. So this is a fundamental problem in our understanding. But what these people don't understand is with a few twists and turns, by the weavers of fate, the self-made man is a self-made bum, effectively. And this is, I think, the fundamental issue. And I think also the left doesn't get this because they're not just looking at luck per se, they're looking at some sort of active deception, which I also think is inaccurate.
Right. So we really should get into this, but yeah, the problem seems to be both the left and right approach, right? So the left answer to this, where the system is unfair, inequality is growing, which are real concerns. I hate to sound leftist like that when I say that, but it is true. When they point to the issue, they point to invisible, intangible, unfalsifiable forces, right? About microtransgressions or whatever else. Like at the end of the day, even if you fixate on that, it's not going to result in a real answer. But then on the right side too, the answer is, well, when you're struggling, that sounds like a you problem. Most people who are struggling probably deserve it. I'm obviously embellishing here. It sounds like a you problem, or you need to work harder, and that's not an answer either. And I think that should be addressed as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the left-right divide. I mean, everyone is in the business of trying to eliminate the very obvious survivorship bias that colors our view of the world. Um, because first off, it certainly doesn't make you feel as cool to acknowledge that, you had a couple of lucky breaks and those were essential for your success. It's much better for your ego, frankly, to just tell yourself a tale of being the self-made man and how your diligence was the primary cause. Not to discount the diligence, but there was certainly luck as well. So I think and the left focuses, as you pointed out, on sort of peripheral issues that don't really go to the heart of the matter, at least those who aren't economically savvy or
Or ones that
interested.
are unfalsifiable or unsolvable. There's
Yeah,
nothing you can do about them.
essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, what's interesting, we should actually get into the specifics there because you're pointing to things which are very much true. But you can even look at this again much more specifically. If you look at successful people who make YouTube channels, for example, about their success in business and whatever, you'll notice every single time they come in the United States anyway, they come from a state where that state is the engine of economic activity in the United States. So usually California, New York, etc. And there's something there to it, and you can't necessarily attribute that to personal success. But then stepping now away from that topic is you can actually point to, as a result of net effects, the system is in fact rigged. And the case the case example for that is the millennial generation, who really have gotten the brunt of it over these past few decades, right? So the millennial generation, along with others, but especially the millennial generation, because they were just starting, they got eviscerated by the Great Recession. I mean, just absolutely eviscerated. And then a second time when they finally were getting back on their feet by now more recently, the current recession. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that for demonetization triggering of the word, but I'm sure everyone knows what I'm saying. Um, and you can see this just by the net result in the division of wealth between millennials and the boomer generations, right? So the boomer generation has always controlled more of stocks and equity than the millennial generation. And now, as a result of government policy, which you can see when there's a bailout, everyone knows this. Guess where it goes? It goes to the stock market. It's just a fact. And now today, you see that millennials, despite being the largest portion of the workforce, they only have 4.6% of US wealth. 4.6%. I mean, that's 4 times poorer than baby boomers at on average of age 34. And a lot of this has to do actually with deliberate systematic rigging you can point to on terms of financial engineering, where it's a double whammy where when a recession happens, public funding goes to the corporations. And the corporations that favor stockholders, which is not the average demographic. It's just not. And when the bailouts don't go to the normal people, they don't have the equities. This problem compounds over and over and over until you get what you have today. And so I know recently you encountered someone from the boomer generation who,
Well,
had some commentary on this. I'd love for you to share.
yeah, I mean, he's not, I mean, to be he's technically an older Gen Xer. We can talk about I call them the forgotten generation, my generation, Gen X. But yeah, I mean, this guy is a sort of the pinnacle of kind of boomer-esque mentality and survivorship bias. I mean, he is successful. He's a guy that he'll tell this tale of working 3 jobs and working his way up the hierarchy and refusing government assistance and he's not I don't even know how to describe him. Sort of everything is sort of voluntarism and yeah, that's fine. But there was this hypothetical discussion about what might may come to pass, sort of robotic baggers or basically robotic implements in a supermarket chain that replace the people working there, and of course the supermarket chain saves money, and these people are then fired. And it was hypothesized that, let's say, this robotic technology only costs $1,000 a year to maintain, versus the 20,000 these, whether they're baggers or some other employees might have gotten. And this guy was actually arguing in authentic terms. I don't think he was trying to just finagle his way out of it. That this was actually a good thing because the $19,000 will now be free to go into the economy, and the person that was fired will benefit from it because there's other employment to be found. And that was basically his argument. And I just I found this a bit sketchy, to say the least, because I'm hardly an expert on investing in stocks, but my sense would be when large scale companies uh, save money, don't they just give it to the people involved in the company, basically shareholders, as opposed to they're not just reinvesting in the economy like magic. It sounds like magic talk to me, you know?
No, right, exactly. So there definitely is an economic gain from technological advancement, just as you were saying, right? So you're going from a $20,000 a year bagger at a grocery store to a $1,000 per year machine, right? And that savings, as you're saying, the $19,000 goes to stockholders. But if you look at the sociological effects of that over and over, right? So when the bag stuffer or whatever loses their job, guess what? Their job progression and net worth goes to zero in some cases. And when you compound that over an entire generation, you get these socially unsustainable outcomes that cause problems. And we know now for where does money in stockholders go? It either goes back to reinvestment or it just sits in accounts. It doesn't. This is well proven now. It does not distribute into the rest of the economy, and we know this.
Yeah, and I think there's also another mentality that goes along with this. I mean, there's one thing very boomer-esque and libertarian-esque. This notion that there there's always sufficient work available, as well as a kind of you can because you should never rely on any sort of government interference. The community, you should drop on the community. But the problem here as well, and it's kind of an adjacent issue, but it's related. Communities don't really exist anymore. Not at least not in urban areas to the extent they ever did. There's no recourse there. Um, and in such a scenario where you're a grocery bagger, what some of these suggestions being offered, one guy was objectivist at the time, that he could trim bushes in a garden. Well, maybe that job exists, maybe it doesn't. I mean, it, it just it's really unfathomable how a person in that situation is going to find any sort of reasonable employment that would be at least comparable to what he used to do.
Yeah, people from that perspective often point out that, back in my day, I would rely on the community. And as you're saying, number one, they don't exist. But number two, you know, those same people who are fine receiving community action, when you talk about the same principle put on a larger scale, right, which is national action to deal with these problems, the arbitrary difference in size is what turns them off from it. So suddenly those same people who want like heavy community involvement and a community fund to deal with these things, when you talk about that on a national level, all of a sudden the brain shuts off. And I think that's really a result of political structuring and political priors, which I think is so important for the right to dispense of, specifically the right.
Well,
This is a problem and you need to have a solution
can
other
I bring up
than
a related point on this? It's
please.
it's very salient. So
Please.
there was a recent discussion about, I mean, this is obviously trigger a lot of people. It's the nature of healthcare, and people were asking me. There are many reasons why I don't want to live in the United States. I don't need to enumerate them, but one of them is just a fear of absolute bankruptcy. I've had two operations in the course of my life, or two major ones. One for a benign tumor, the other for what's called an inguinal hernia. But those you don't know, it's when basically your guts spill out over in your groin area. It needs to be plugged back up. I don't know what that would have cost in the United States, but I pay a few hundred, equivalent of a few $100s a month in, in a form of what you could call an insurance tax. And basically, all such operations are covered. There aren't additional costs to that. And presumably, to the best of my knowledge, if I need an even more serious operation, like a kidney transplant, and I pray to the gods that doesn't come to pass, um, that too would be covered under the auspices of this type of insurance policy. Now, this I don't see this as ideological position because one thing I want to point out is, frankly, that in the context of Europe, things like that are not right left issues. They're sort of settled issues. That a system like that is just for the common good, the common weal, is sort of better for your average person at least. Whereas noticeably in the United States, I mean, there are all sorts of boo words invoked, sort of socialized. I don't socialize healthcare, whatever. And the way it works, by the way, is it scales in accordance with your income, right? In say Germany, but that's kind of a
There's so many
settled.
different ways you could approach it, not just the German way as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm citing the one I'm most familiar with, but the point is that's not a right left issue. It's not a way. It's sort of settled business. It's like it's akin to should we have trams in our city or not? Oh, if it's a
Exactly, yeah.
socialist policy to have trams, oh, we better. In the United States, it's already hot, but it's a serious concern because and actually got some of these people who are all gung ho about the U.S. agreeing with me that yeah, they don't even with their insurance policies from their fancy schmancy jobs, they just don't know at times where the costs are coming from, and it is obviously complicated. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved. I get it, but I think that there's this. I mean, socialize this social. It's a boo word
Indeed.
that I think a lot of people who are actually on the right in a European context don't don't really subscribe to, and just because it's a non-issue effectively. This is not the same thing as the marginal tax rate, which one could discuss. It's just sort of for the common man, what is a better system to dwell in? And I point this out too. People give me hell for this, but for your average person, living in a Western European environment is much better health-wise, psychological, all, and the list goes on, than living in the United States, where you're always going to be within a hair's breadth of possibly ending up homeless, and who knows. But there's an example. I mean, it's anecdotal, but apparently it's true, of some woman who needed a very important operation that would have bankrupted the family. And I think she had several kids and whatever. In her case, her decision was to take the hit and die so her family would have the funds to persist. I mean, it's a noble sacrifice, I guess. And if you want to use the sort of American ideology, you can spin it. Well, that's what a true American would do. But obviously, if you scale, I'm not saying that's a common occurrence, but and that people wouldn't get treatment. I mean, people do get treated almost consistently. It's just that when the bills come in, that's when the problems emerge. So it's one example, but I don't really see this as a left-right issue, though. Of course, everyone listening is going to frame it this: "Oh, start us a communist." I'm not. I definitely have some, whatever the issue might be. I still have a significant number of right-leaning tendencies, but these are the
As
kind
do
of
I.
yeah, I mean, you come from a more right-wing background than I do. It's just that there's a certain realization about how functional the world is that just forces you at some point in time to just skip past allegiance to a quote unquote ideology, such as matters of this, is the system rigged? Do these things actually work? Where I think most people, even though it's an extreme example, but it's true, taking one for the team just because we're under a different system, and there are different systems, but basically every system I'm familiar with, whether it's the Scandinavian one, the Dutch one, the French one, the German one, they're not perfect, but that woman wouldn't have needed to take one for the team, so to speak, right?
Mm, mm. Yeah, sometime later we should actually discuss you're pointing out something very interesting, the difference between the American mentality versus the European one, where the American one, especially the right version of that, seems stuck at the community level when it's talking about like group community action, right? Public welfare, public health. Those are buzzword terms. Where, as you're saying, in Europe, it's not as much of a problem. And there definitely is a huge, huge difference there. And the best way, at least for me, my transformation, my way of approaching is that again, um, people see the value of community action. You can see the intertwinedness of how one person's life, your neighbor, your immediate neighbor, affects yours, right? If your neighbor's having a rough time, you can see that manifested in so many different ways. It depends what you care about. Maybe they're more irritable. Maybe they're more prone to turn to crime. Maybe their house looks worse. Your property value's gone. Whatever you want to care about, you can see that happen. Now, the important thing is just to take that thinking and then extrapolate it to the national level. And you can see that with, I know it's more impersonal because then you just look at statistics, but the statistics are in. The millennial generation is in one of the worst positions in history. They have the least amount of wealth accumulated, they're less likely to marry, they're not reaching major life goals. And I can just tell you, there are already manifesting and already downstream massive endemic social problems that are coming from this. And, raise yourself up by your bootstraps, that sounds like a you problem, is not an acceptable answer. Um, and as you were saying, yeah, so it's very easy to understand that in a town that if everyone chips in and you pave the road, there are going to be massive multiplicative downstream effects that will benefit everyone in terms of general health. And I know these are sound like buzzword terms coming from a left, almost dare I say, boo-boo word socialist view, but it's a true thing where you have a bit of unfortunately, as we have to say, no man's an island. You have an investment in everyone else around you as well. And I think it's time to tear down the artificial barriers on that. And one thing that I've noticed is that as a result of policy favoring investments and stockholders, every time there's a major economic collapse, at least in the United States, where does the money go? It goes to the markets, it goes to the corporations. Not everyone's holding stock in that. For example, you were once told by someone you're talking to when they were trying to give you financial advice, perhaps unsolicited, why don't you just invest in real estate? That'll solve your problem.
With
Um,
all my incredible wealth, I'm actually a
right.
secret multi-billionaire, just nobody knows about it.
Not just you. That's not a viable option for, I would imagine, 9 out of 10
99,
people.
yeah,
It's not
yeah. I
it's
mean,
not viable.
yeah, exactly. And this person in particular, I mean, here's a perfect example of survivorship bias. This guy is a scion of a long-standing century-old house, stemming originally from Venice, of essentially noble real estate investors. I mean, so sure, when you come from a 400-year-old noble house of real estate investors, then you can make that suggestion and it makes sense to you. Maybe you know some other people from such noble houses. I don't know, but for the vast majority of people, just investing in real estate, the starting capital to be able to do that is astonishingly great, and you would need to have. So it just the disconnect is there is just is blatant there. This guy's a millennial, by the way. So it's kind of
Not a typical one, but I understand
not
what
a
you're saying.
typical one, but it just goes to show that even within certain generations, all you need is a different. The fates of need only cast their die in a certain way, and that can morph your mind and then make things seem much more reasonable when they're not. I mean, the sort of just invest in real estate, bruh argument. I mean, who actually takes that seriously for your average person?
People need to extrapolate beyond themselves, and this is a topic you've talked about in depth in many of your videos.
Well, I want to say, I guess, sorry for interrupting. I obviously have a very dismal view of this of the human species. Anyone who's been listening to me knows that, and you're a you're a personal friend of mine, so I mean, you know that better than most. I'm not sure we're wired to do this. The amount of effort it takes to do that, the amount of thought and life experience too. I think you need to have certain experiences. I think for me, it's definitely been just health issues piled upon health issues that made me realize that this isn't as simple as just you just got to work hard and you'll be fine.
Mm.
And I think that i- it's not going to be something for most people to realize this problem of self-extrapolation. There's also, by the way, even when I should point this out myself, self-extrapolation. So you take example of this boomer-esque older Gen Xer with his story of three jobs and whatever. That it's there's also this idea of it. You talked about community. It's not my problem. So anyone else's. Everything is sort of predicated on voluntarism. But even that sort of falls apart because he still supports. I don't know, funding police or the
You
fire
can take the
department.
social thinking too far, that's for sure. You can take
Oh,
it way
without
too far.
question, I don't. There's certain social things I wouldn't favor. I'm not. I mean, we don't need to go down affirmative action. I don't think is a good thing. There are all sorts of things I'm not in favor of. But the problem is if everyone has the mentality of it's your problem, not my problem, I don't think it's sufficient. I don't think self-interest is sufficient under these terms. Actually, because we see this. I mean, you look at what happened during the 2008 recession, the Great Recession. According to the U.S. government at the time, I was employed. I had a bunch of part-time jobs, but I couldn't make rent. So I
That's
mean, I
right.
was I was still employed though, so it doesn't really matter. Um, that it was self-interest that drove the powers that be to basically funnel a whole bunch of money into the shadowy forces of Wall Street, if you will, and what have you. Um, we know factually that self-interest did not redound to the benefit of the great masses majority of people.
No,
So
the system can't deny it, which is why they point to downstream effects like, various wealth gap inequalities and not the fundamental root of the issue, which you just touched on right now, right here.
yeah, I mean, it is it's I suppose there's a
Everyone's forced to acknowledge it.
yeah, I mean there acknowledging that no man is an island doesn't mean you have to care about every human being on planet Earth, or even in your own country. But you have to acknowledge that there's some kind of interconnectedness that if you give enough sufficient time, ignore that, can lead to uh, a breaking down of the system. And we see this just throughout the United States. I mean, look at things like fentanyl addiction and just the things that are
Mm,
happening in flyover states, the things that the people that the left in particular, these coastal elites, have so much contempt for. Some guy in Cincinnati, Ohio, even as we speak, he's probably, drunk and ODing on fentanyl right now. There's someone doing that right now.
that's why I
And
say to the right, the potential reward for having a good answer to this is amazing. It's spectacular, extraordinary, and I think you're leaving a lot as a right person on the table by not stepping forward on this.
yeah, I mean, the answer in this case, clearly, if community were sufficient, well, these communities don't exist in these places. Otherwise, it's arguable whether or not. I mean, if these people, these men in particular, who are largely millennials, well, not entirely, the increasingly millennials, also Gen Xers, but again, forgotten generation for various reasons, if they actually had a sense of community, a sense of belonging, the rely, as well as work they could do, it seems unlikely to me that they would simply fall into the addictions. They might struggle with some kind of addiction, but they would have much more of a support network. But again, ranting on about community when communities don't exist anymore to a large degree doesn't help the situation. Um, yeah, I know we weren't planning on talking about, but I do want to bring up federalism for just a bit
Please.
because it's a hypothetical. Obviously, I think federalism has been canned and dead for quite some time for a variety of reasons.
Are you referring to, like, the revolutionary era thought of federalism of
Yeah,
descending the
sort of
United
the
States
Tenth
or a different
Amendment
one?
stuff that
Gotcha.
y- I'm of the view, and I might be fully wrong about this, that um, barring a few exceptions, large countries, just in terms of mass, as well as population, but mostly in mass in the United States, here's you could say a right-wing talking point, but I mean, I don't really look at it as right or left. I just think it makes sense that allowing states to mediate their own affairs, independent of federal interference, could be a good solution to a variety of these problems, not all of them, in the sense that um, they would be work at scale and arguably within quote unquote communities that they're much more connected to. I mean, the problem I think in part with the United States is it's so big. And
Mm,
so not allowing Iowa to just do Iowa and Alaska to do Alaska, which I mean they do themselves in their own respects, but Alaska has, for example, this oil dividend that's paid off to its citizens. Uh, but
which
that's
very few people you'll find complaining about
mm,
it as social engineering or whatever, anyway.
yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to prove that you've been living there for a certain number of time, a couple of years, amount of time. But the point is that allowing states to whatever it might be. For example, there are a number of drug treatment problems, drug treatment issues that have emerged in Europe that have been combated relatively efficiently in places like Portugal, Switzerland, and elsewhere that arguably could not be affected at a federal level in the United States. But if you imagine, I don't know, Vermont just deciding like we're gonna try this Portuguese experiment with drug addiction, decriminalization, whatever. Maybe it would work. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it would be a colossal failure. I don't know. I mean, countries are different in their histories and their makeup, and it's complicated, obviously. But so I think, and this is purely theoretical, the neglect and disregard of things like the 10th Amendment and states getting more agency in the United States could make a lot of these problems better. I mean, not solve all of them, but I think that I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very hard to come up with a one size fits all solution for a continent spanning country.
Yeah,
And what you're talking about, I need to think more about it. I don't really have a definitive opinion, but it's a good halfway point between people who are stuck in the community only mindset and people who can't extrapolate that to the whole idea of a national community or a national level action on that. So yeah, what you're saying is definitely worth considering. And it's telling though that again that it was considered in the past. Right. Now,
yeah.
obviously, the distances and logistical problems dealing with the United States have changed a great deal, but so is the size of the country as well. This isn't the 13 colonies it used to be.
No, sadly not.
I'd actually like to, if you don't mind, pivot back to Wall Street for a minute.
Sure.
Yeah, so one thing people need to consider is that, right? So we've talked a lot about how every time there's a financial crash, public money goes to bail out corporations. And that has deleterious social effects. But one thing to consider is the very idea of a corporation itself, right? So that can trace its roots back to 1600s, 1700s. You can think of like the Dutch East Indies Company, etc. So all these European exchanges, and the purpose of those ventures, the purpose of those stockholders was to create ventures that would go out in the world to extract resources. And when you're talking about the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, yeah, the world, especially the new continents, were flush with resources, but we're not in that world anymore. And so, favoring a model where most of society is pointed towards driving these resource extractor companies or these consumption organizations, otherwise known as corporations, maybe isn't viable in 2020 any longer. Maybe it's time to take a different approach to it rather than continually funneling every time there's a problem public money into enterprises dedicated towards consumption and resource extraction on a planet that has limited resources.
Yeah, of course, in the United States, things like lobbying, play a huge issue.
Right,
Campaign
practical
finance.
obstacles aside. I'm just
Yeah,
talking
oh,
generally.
yes, practical obstacles aside. Yeah, I think, but also I think there's a part of the issue in the United States is that I call it the shopping mall mentality, is that commerce commerce is it's a divine activity effectively. It's not just something that's really important or useful. It is been it has been effectively deified or enshrined in almost a sacred manner. It's become, well, it's effectively, it's holy. We've talked about this before, the making of economic zone, that that kind of mentality is very difficult to shake. This idea that the only thing that matters are things like GDP and commerce and markets and money. And of
Mm,
course, these are super important, money, but that there are other issues that can affect people that even given sufficient money. I mean, there are some millennials with money, and I know of some of them, and they're still depressed and suicidal, frankly speaking. So there are other issues.
indeed.
It's complicated. Um,
Right.
yeah.
If I may interject here, yeah, but the problem is though, again, if you have a financial system and a society based around corporations and stocks, something that can derive its origin or you can trace its origin back to the 16 and 1700s where again it's these ventures that go out and try to extract as much resources as possible and come back. And back then, the type of person who was a stockholder in the 16 and 1700s was such a tiny sliver of the population. But nowadays, what's your answer when you're financially struggling? Usually the answer is like, well, you got to invest. Maybe not everybody should be investing. I mean, maybe society shouldn't revolve around that because that is the answer I see people give now from time to time, particularly on YouTube. You don't have financial security, you don't have financial independence, you got to invest. Well, it's a circular loop. How do you invest? And by the way, if you don't have any money in the first place, And by the way, I don't come from a position of complaining about this. I, in fact, do have investments, but I'm also able to extrapolate beyond this that, this path that I'm on is not viable or even possible for a great majority of people.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's
And I
a
don't think it's a sustainable system. Sure, it's good for me, but I don't think it's a sustainable system overall.
yeah, I think that's an important point. It's
A good counterexample is the person you were talking about, how after you drill down on their mentality, this is one of those, when you're struggling, that's a you problem, not a society problem. He admitted that, for example, he knows that other people will do charity and will be generous, and he doesn't have to if there were a
yeah,
social action.
I,
You could please continue on that.
yeah, I think look, obviously you can't be concerned about strangers because there's no connection there. Um, but I think a bit of frankness would be useful if not devastating in the sense that look, the whole this guy's whole argument is essentially when it boiled down to it, that other people will take care of these problems as long as I don't have to. Now, sure, but I think that's part of the thing that you just acknowledged. Yeah, it's good for you, your investment schemes and stuff, but most people don't even have the money. It's like sort of the real estate thing, right? Like, they don't have the money to invest, or they just don't have these options. So coming up with some like you're not doing this, but obviously well, we just got to work harder, do this. That's not a good answer. It's not an answer really at all. And sure, you can say it's a you problem, but what happens if on scale, and I think that's what we're seeing, you have increasingly a kind of technocratic corporate elite in the United States
Indeed.
that where everything is just a you. It's not even a you problem. I have talked to people who walk the hallowed halls of Silicon Valley. We're talking about some of the brightest people, human beings on the planet. And I had the fortune recently of talking to one such man who didn't come from such a background, came from a rather poor, one of the exceptions. And the way these people, I mean, the man, the man tilling the soil in Iowa is like a gnat to these people. It barely exists. These are not, they're not even recognized as human. Now, I've talked about this before, this concept of noblesse oblige. The difference also between you talked about the Dutch Indies company and general mercantilism in general, the emergence, so transitioning off of feudalism. Not that I want to go back to a feudal system, but at least the feudal system, the lord had obligations to the serfs.
Not anymore,
The
yeah.
lord, the hallowed lord in Silicon Valley has no. I mean, he doesn't he doesn't care one way whatsoever. I mean, these people are barely the plebs are barely they barely exist for them, and that was
You can
not.
see this in You can see this in attitude very quickly. You can see this in attitudes towards lockdowns, right? So tech workers who have the ability to work from home, frankly, their work and occupation isn't that affected during these coronavirus lockdowns. But if you're again someone in Iowa, you got a brick and mortar store or a little diner or whatever, they hate that. They can't stand it. And that is a difference, as you're saying, in mentality between the Silicon Valley worker and a normal person.
Yeah, and frankly, the lack of noblesse oblige. This is a recent phenomenon. Going
Indeed.
back to ancient Mesopotamia, kings needed backings, nobles. They needed the people to get behind them to some degree. A kingdom without subjects was not a kingdom. And likewise, a manorial lord who relied on serfs to deliver crops and goods had to ensure some level of protection. I don't think we can go back there. I'm not suggesting we should even. It's just that we need to acknowledge that part of this massive divide, and which is ongoing now for the last couple of years, it's really been accelerating. I mean, I know you and I talk about the good old days of 2015 as if this were, a different century almost, and sometimes it feels that way. But
Indeed.
that needs to be acknowledged because I frankly think that the cognitive elite, through a combination of just dislocation, you mentioned it, they're in California, or mostly in California, but also sometimes in New York or DC.
Sometimes Washington too.
Washington, yeah, DC, New York, California, California being the biggest one, coupled by just sort of survivorship bias and just isolation, cultural play. They just the people talk about, I mean, TDS and Trumpism and whatever your thoughts on Trump might be, the fact that these people can't fathom how some people would quote unquote stoop to support Trump is very telling. Most recently, Sam Harris, who isn't really, I mean, he's an elite, he's not a tech elite. He went on this rant about it was borderline insane about Trump and the people who voted for him. So yeah, and he pays lip service to sort of wealth inequality, but it's very telling, and I think that until it's acknowledged that there is an actual rigging of the system, and it has nothing to do per se with left or right, that everyone who's not, I don't know, a tech lord in Silicon Valley or a mover of money in Wall Street is and somehow suffering from this. It's a problem. And the thing is too, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding, moving money isn't productive labor, is it? You're not producing goods for
Certainly
the
not.
market. I mean, it's it's not like you're a shoemaker back in the day producing quality shoes that people can wear. So what is the argument to support these people?
Well, this is the era of MMT, modern monetary policy, and the best argument I've seen in terms of the value of that is that people who move money are capital allocators. And a capital allocator is that they're so gifted and principled and guided that they're diverting money or resources to certain projects which actually do benefit, right, the economy and society. And it's because they're so smartly choosing where to allocate capital resources, that means, in fact, it is a benefit to society.
Yes, well, clearly the 2008 9 bailouts were very beneficial to all of us. And yeah,
Yeah, that's right. That's why the decision is to capitally allocate to massive corporations and then watch when the downstream effects get worse and worse. What you said about Sam Harris actually is we've ragged enough on the right enough. What you said about Sam Harris is perfectly emblematic of the left's problem on this, right? So he can turn to a Trump supporter and say, "Oh yeah, I understand your problem. It's because of wealth inequality." Well, what does that mean to them? That, that, that's one of the downstream effects of what's going on. It's not an answer. It doesn't, frankly, even make them feel better. It's not even good comfort or therapy. I mean, that is a pointless. That's a vapid answer to the problem we're discussing right now: wealth inequality. Well, then so what? So then, what do we do about it? What's causing it? Nothing like that.
well, and more to the point, I mean, I think
It's a buzzword.
for Sam Harris, it's also a band. I don't think he actually cares. I mean, I know he pays for mosquito nets in Africa too. I think Sam Harris in particular, he's very big on sort of virtue signaling. So I think that's part of that. There's also
Mm,
condescension
yeah, yeah. Oh,
contained
I
therein.
understand. Well, yeah, you're
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 only voting for Drumpf because you don't have you're struggling. I get it. I don't blame you or something along those lines.
yeah. So then again, to the left, this is why you fail.
Yeah, yeah. I think
This is why you're losing people.
yeah, but I mean, I think the fundamental problem here is as time goes on, the division, the rift is growing. It's the biggest it's been, and I think in the course of my lifetime. And
Indeed, and it's not a result of who's tweeting what or whatever news cycle says the latest action in the Senate was. It's not that.
that's an accelerant. I do think it's accelerant. It's like putting,
Of course, yeah.
just mixing oil with water, but a bit. But yeah, I mean, I think the underlying problems are generally not talked about. And I think the tech overlords and the like, and the movers of money are all too happy to have an over focus on matters of sort of social media and what have you, which they do these things do derange us, but the unsustainability of the current economic system, with people either just being told, as you've pointed out, with the left, that it's sort of uh, these people
Inequality.
inequality, people or I like to think they also think people are just cheating, and I guess to some degree they are. But and the right's, well, it's you're just not working hard enough. If you worked hard enough, you would be fine. And
Or stop looking for handouts, don't, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. I'd love actually just real quick, just take a, to people listening and also to you, take a gut check. In the 80s and the 90s, when you were talking about personal finance with people, was the answer ever, you need to open a stock portfolio? No. I think that's a good bellwether indicator of what's going on now. I mean, back then, the answer was definitely not, your financial plan is you need to get involved in the stock market heavily and become a speculator on the side.
or invest in real estate. Unless, I mean, people would say that if you had the capital, but they were going
Yeah,
to.
yeah, no, yeah, it's definitely a smart financial move, but that wasn't the answer for most people. I would say it was more of
No,
a, just a niche activity
if
for
you're
other
working at
people.
a diner, I mean, why don't you just go invest in some real estate?
But
Nobody.
yeah, but in 2020, I mean, that's the YouTube financial advice. So the answer in 2020 is you gotta open a stock brokerage. You gotta become a speculator. You need real estate ASAP. Not an answer.
Yeah. The question, though, I mean, as we wind down, is what would be at least an approximation of an answer?
Oh, gee, that is a big, big question, and I'm not equipped to answer that in the slightest. I'm just here to point out the problem.
Neither am I. I think, I mean, I want to, I want to plug for, I know I'm going to get a lot of heat for this, but I want to plug for some, I mean, given these issues, I think whether you like it or not, there's a kind of almost inevitability to some form of UBI
Hmm.
um, down the line. I mean, I know I will get a lot of heat because there's a lot of hostility to the idea, but y- look, we can live in a world of effectively the Matthew principle. For those who don't know, I mean, it's from the Bible, right? To those who have, more will shall be given. To those who have little, all shall be taken. That's kind of what's. I mean, it's always been that way, but it's really been accelerated in recent years. Now, the question is, do we collectively want to live in a world of? And I hate this film. It was a terrible film, but the principle was sort of Elysium of
Hmm.
Matt Damon, where you have this
Visually brilliant, the actual writing not so much.
writing
As in, like, the
terrible
context of it.
story crap,
The
but
idea,
the
though.
idea
Oh,
was
the
good. The
idea.
idea was good
Yes.
of people living essentially off of planet Earth and a different species that isn't a different species, basically. Do you want to
Mhm.
live in a world where we're so separated, where, I mean, California's a good example, where you have just fabulous concentrations of wealth, and a few miles down, you have people ODing on heroin
Slums.
and pools
Yeah.
of their own excrement. So it's kind of,
Needles in the street.
yeah, that is not a sustainable model long term because there's an interconnectedness, whether we acknowledge it, but just identify the fact we all live on planet Earth. So some kind of solution. I don't know what the solution is exactly. I think UBI might help, but I'm not an economics expert, and of course everyone's going to rage about the problems with that. Or do we want to just live in a society, a world increasingly, where people have almost nothing, and a select few have virtually everything. You talked about wealth concentration and just how
And then
little.
on top of that, there are technological barriers that unfortunately, like, like, one person and their labor and productivity will never be able to overcome. Just the difference in disparity of wealth and, like,
Absolutely.
the Elysium situation.
You grow up
You
in Newton,
can't outwork a
Iowa.
cashier drive. You
Yeah.
can't outwork a cashier drive to go into Elysium. It's just not gonna happen.
No,
Cashier job, I should say.
and if you're, we point on the geographical though, if you're born in some small town in Iowa or North Dakota, it's
Admittedly, that's easier to solve if you manage to move out, but I get your
if you
point.
manage to move. But even that, moving costs money. You have to listen. How many times you have to listen to Shapiro the guru? Well, GDP's up 7.3%, and there are plenty of jobs. You just got to move.
Also
Well,
not an answer.
also
Yeah.
not. I mean, yeah, he's a multimillionaire who's recently moved to Nashville, Tennessee, because he didn't like California taxes. Great for him. But if you're struggling, you come from a poor family, and you're say white
You might be
working
doing the
class.
opposite from Tennessee to California
Yeah, I mean, these
to a
moving
lesser
is not
extent these days.
moving entails costs as well. So again, I don't know what the solution is exactly, and I suppose there's a kind of flaw in that. We're picking at the system, I think, in an honest, sincere way, but not offering. Everyone wants a solution, but it does start with acknowledging some of the problems, and I just don't think we're the left talks about superficial issues, the right does. Um, and I think that we're at a stage now where this is going to get worse. And in as much as social media deranges us and kind of spreads the forest fire, so to speak, that too will get worse as a consequence of these other things. So as the wealth gap and wealth inequality grows and people are more and more displaced from just a functional life, and it revolves around, look, obviously, you know, I'm not endorsing marriage, I'm MGTOW, whatever. But for normal people, having a normal course of life, the whole 9 yards, blah, 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 growing up, getting married, having kids. That's what most people want, most human beings. Those are increasingly not options for them. And I don't think for the vast majority of people, the MGTOW option is going to be an option. Um, so what's going to end up happening? They're going to be disgruntled, depressed, suicidal. I mean, yeah, if the numbers, and here's my final point, if the numbers of such people grow sufficient, then you're going to see it everywhere, and society itself becomes non-functional. It's just a question of time. It's a numbers question as well as a time question. And you can't escape to the stratosphere like in Elysium. You can't, or actually it's beyond the stratosphere in that case, but gated communities will only do so much. So and whether it's the left's unfalsifiable claims, if it's all bias and racism, or the right's, it's all just socialism. These are non-answers. These are buzzwords that do nothing to solve the problem. And as much as I've offered no solutions, at least we're trying to get a crack at what the underlying problem is here.
Well said. My answer, I don't know enough about UBI. I haven't really investigated enough, but my place where I would start looking is an honest look at the welfare system. And I don't want to, dredge this topic up too much so we stay here forever. But there's a lot to be changed about the existing welfare system, regardless of the country. I would argue a lot of it's dysgenic. A lot of it is actually dedicated to lost cause type of people, and I mean like in the worst sense, like as in like totally dysfunctional, even borderline psychopathic people. We have an almost religious mythos about helping people who are, again, the more dysfunctional and the harder they have it, the better. And maybe you need to take a different approach to that and see it as more of an investment on people like you can actually reasonably help and actually not worship dysfunction and then try to divert as much money from productive people to people in those situations. I just think we need to take a look at the dysgenic versions of welfare as well.
Well, yeah, I think what you're talking about, I would term blank check
Yes,
welfarism.
blank check, where yeah, blank check welfare, exactly. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that, and I'd have an issue with. I agree with you. I think that if
You know this
somehow,
where does a lot of this welfare I know it's such a nasty talking point, but we everyone knows this, everyone sees this. A lot of times welfare money, it goes to consumption, and you know which kind of consumption I'm talking about.
oh yeah, just it's yeah. I think that in theory you could have a welfare system which sort of invested in people who, I don't know how you would assess this. I mean, there would be some metrics who would
Just saying where to look. I don't know the answer.
yeah, to people who would make better use of it rather than just popping out 10,000 babies and just blowing it on Cheetos or whatever else it might be. But I think that there's also an idiot. I think I mean, I hate to take swipes at the right, but I also recently encountered, we're talking about the obesity epidemic in the United States, and this guy was actually saying that's the price of freedom. And I mean,
Whoa. I hadn't
yeah,
heard this one.
well, yeah, this was fairly recent. I was trying to explain to him. He said, "Well, these." He was pointing out the odd. Well, these people are just quote unquote lazy. They're just fat and they don't exercise. We all know this. They know this too, but the problem isn't going away.
But it happens anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that pointing that out doesn't fucking help. Probably shouldn't be swearing, but too late. It doesn't really help. We know this. They know this. They know that they quote unquote should be exercising and putting down the fork. This is known. Everyone knows this by now. The point is most of them are not. So it's a problem. And his
You
answer is,
can make,
well,
excuses and copes for them, and, you can get to the answer in a second. You can make excuses and copes for those people. Like, I know I'm not as sugar sensitive as some other people, so it's easier for me to avoid those kind of foods, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
sure. I mean, again, survive. I mean, when it comes to nutrition, we're all very different at the individual level. So
Indeed.
there's that. But in general, yeah, exercise, calorie restriction, yeah, that's the key. Blah blah blah. Okay, but his
You
answer,
guys
this
answer.
his non-answer is, well, that's just the price of freedom, and we value freedom in the United States. I
Okay. Platitude.
The worst platitude as well. I even went so far as to describe it as not a medical problem. It's a hard work problem
Personal
basically.
responsibility or something?
Personal
Yeah, yeah, okay.
responsibility.
Okay, okay.
This is great to listen to. The problem is when you have an obesity epidemic, you can offer all the platitudes in the world. This is one example. If the problem persists in great consequence and great quantity, then the platitudes are clearly not helping. So you need to You need to exercise and put down the fork.
An
Okay.
answer which establishes your moral or personal or competent superiority is not an answer that will solve the problem.
At the same time, they're saying, well, we don't want to pay for these people with the socialized medicine. Okay, which is it? I mean, all right, I just don't. Is it's the price of freedom? Well, that doesn't tell you anything. I mean, and increasingly, I mean, this is a bit off topic, but preventative medicine is going to be the medicine of the future, well before we get to things like gene editing and proper gene editing and what have you. So, I don't know. I think that both sides have their ideological blinders on. Social media definitely reinforces that, and they're just not examining the actual underlying problem. And never mind, I mentioned Gen X. I don't know what happened to Gen X. I think it's kind of hit or miss. Some Gen Xers are doing fabulously well, others not so much. Probably somewhere in between. Um, but
We left
I,
a bit on the table, but that's all right.
well, as a final point, I just say that I noticed some of these trends even in the 90s. I think said this before, this obsession with this idea that college or university was somehow the ticket, the meal ticket to a good job or gainful employment. That was
Maybe it
already
was. I wasn't around for that.
it was already crumbling in the mid 90s when I was hearing this rhetoric. You gotta, it doesn't matter what you study hard, go to college, and you'll get a good job. People want the economy wants well-rounded people. Okay, whatever. That already was crumbling in the 90s, and I think in the early 2000s it was defunct and dead. So I think Gen X definitely was beginning to witness some of that. But
Yeah, you could see the effects of choppy waters on Gen X for sure.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, we've been talking for a while. Now, hopefully, not all my audience disappears because of my alleged conversion to quote unquote communism. But that's a perfect example of another platitude. I've heard I've heard the Scandinavian mixed market economies be referred to as communist, which is, I mean, a bit,
Interesting.
yeah, yeah. But this is the problem. You can't really navigate these waters because of the ideological divide. And I don't have a fear of this. I don't consider myself belonging to either right or left. But if you make a move on the chessboard, so to speak, people are going to pin you down as either white or black, right? You're going to be you're not rather than just sort of looking at the overall chess game, so to speak.
You're
So
using a chess analogy, right?
yes, I am. Yes, I'm
Okay,
not. I'm
okay.
not using erasure, but rather, right. So I don't know. I don't think by my final point would be it's a pessimistic one. What else would you expect from me? Humans are a bunch of dumb apes. We are terribly unaware of our own cognitive biases. It would really behoove us to become aware of these because maybe we could work at solutions for these things, or at least partial solutions. But as long as we're entrenched in our own particular ideological backyards and refuse to free ourselves of that, we are we're going to be screwed. And rest assured, I will in the comments section hear all sorts of accusations of me being either probably more likely a communist, socialist, far lefty, and or more minimalistically a person on the far right or some kind of right wing nut. So I don't know what the
I'll try
solution
to
is.
speak to that, very quickly. I didn't wanna originally in the past, I didn't wanna be in the position I am now, but the problems are so you can't ignore them. Something has to be done, and that's what we're trying
Yeah, and I
in a
think
very, very small way.
in your own case that you've pointed out, it's been observations of your own, friends and people in your own life who have suffered health issues and various other struggles, which made you aware of things that maybe you in your own life hadn't been aware of, and that's the problem.
Yeah, that you can't always work your way out of a problem on
Yeah,
your own
yeah, it
or,
just doesn't
whatever else.
just
The
doesn't
world's
work
in a
that
bad
well. So.
place. Everyone can see that, and maybe we have to ditch some of our priors if we're gonna move forward.
Pretty much, I think that's a good point to finish off on. But anyway, I'm gonna thank my guest for joining me. It's always good to have him on.
Thank you.
I hope uh, I hope the audience appreciates the talk, whatever your disagreements might be. And until the next time, if I'm still alive, you take care. As always, may the gods watch over you, fortune favor you. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye bye.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.